Good morning, everybody. It is April 25th, and this is ABF lesson number 7,422 on how the story ends. I am wearing my hooded sweatshirt. It is cold out there today while I'm recording this. I'm hoping that by the end of this section, I'll be able to be back in my more appropriate warmer weather clothing, my t-shirt, my short sleeve shirt, whatever. But in the meantime, this is what we've got. And I am thrilled beyond description to be able to talk to you today about God's eternal kingdom. The last couple of weeks we've been dealing with this. We talked about the new heavens and the new earth. We talked about Earth 1.0, which is the world that we experience today. And then we have Earth 2.0, which God is creating either from the previous material of Earth 1.0, or he's starting over brand new from scratch. Either way, we get a new heaven, we get a new earth. And today, the action really gets going. And the interesting part of all of this is that in verse 2, after we notice, and so again, we have to sort of put ourselves in John's position. John is having a vision. He's being shown selective pieces of what's to come. He's not being shown everything. His job is to describe what he sees. And the first thing that he sees in verse 1 says, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. So verse 1, we look around and we realize we are in a whole new place. This is a whole new world. This isn't just a rehash of the old world, or a little bit of paint put onto the old destructed and destroyed world that we used to have. This is a brand new thing. Now, there is continuity and similarities between this new world and the old world. In fact, you could almost say that they're probably I don't want to say mirror images of each other, but they're connected to one another. There's going to be similarities, but there's going to be some significant differences. And the biggest difference that John points out starts in verse 2. And I'm going to do like a sneaky pastor trick here. And I'm going to smuggle in some backstory to all of this. Because if we just read what's there and then just merrily start running through the rest of the passage, we're going to miss so much of the depth of what we're seeing. So let's see what John sees in verse 2, because that now is going to really propel the action forward in the rest of what we see in God's eternal kingdom. Okay? Verse 2 says this, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. So, John notices first, okay, I'm in a whole new world here. There's similarities to the world that I knew, but this is a brand new world, new heavens, new earth. No more any sea out there. And now, as I look up, I see something coming down out of heaven from God to earth. And what is it that I see descending? What is it that I see that's coming to earth? Have the aliens finally come with their UFOs? No, apparently not. What's coming down out of heaven from God is a city. It's a holy city, and it's called the New Jerusalem, and it's described as a bride adorned for her husband. Now, that's an interesting imagery. We'll probably get to that a little bit later, but the key thing is that she is just resplendent, right? Like a woman on her wedding day probably takes more time and attention and care to prepare herself to be seen than on any other day of her life. Now, maybe that's not totally true, but I think it's certainly at least partly true. The attention, the care given to every little detail, so that when she comes through those double doors like in our church auditorium, and the doors are open and she's revealed in all of her beauty and all of her glory, jaws drop, because all the beauty that has always been there has now been revealed. So this city coming down out of heaven is like a bride prepared for her husband. She's resplendent. She is glorious. She is prepared perfectly for whoever is going to live in this city. And it's this moment of tense anticipation. Now, I want to keep going because I want to tell you what life is going to be like in this new city. And I will, and we're going to get there, I promise. But first, we have to do what I'm calling an origin story for this New Jerusalem. Well, we've got to understand what in the world, there's a city coming down out of heaven, landing on earth. Like, why would that be important? Why would John talk about that? And why would that be a good thing, right? Like, can't we build our own city? Like, why do we need some recycled city from heaven somewhere? Why can't we just build our own? We're here on earth. We're going to be living in this new heaven and this new earth. Let's go build. We know how to build cities. Let's build ourselves some cities here. To understand why this is so significant, we have to go backwards. And I'm sorry. I know I've been doing this for like 17 years now. But we got to go back, because I think once we catch all of the backstory, the origin story of this New Jerusalem, and we understand what it is, its arrival will be that much more significant to us, okay? So here we go. Let's get to a few blanks here in your notes, and then we'll dive into this together. The biggest difference between Earth 1.0 and Earth 2.0 is the descent of the holy city called, and here's the blanks, called the New Jerusalem out of heaven from God to Earth 1.0, okay? So we have Earth 1.0, Earth, and then we have Earth 2.0. And in Earth 1.0, there's this city called Jerusalem. And we're going to get into that in just a minute. The importance of this city to the Jewish people and to the story of the Bible. This is by far the most significant place on planet Earth, according to the Bible. The physical location, this is literally the most significant in the unfolding story of the Bible. Earth 2.0, the major difference is, just like we have a new Earth, right? We also have a new Jerusalem. Or what you might say, it's Jerusalem 2.0. So we get not only a new heaven and a new earth, but we get a new Jerusalem to replace the old Jerusalem. So this is Jerusalem 1.0. Now, why is that significant? Why is that important? We'll get to that. But here's the thing. This is the most significant difference. The rest of what we know in Revelation 21 and the early part of 22 about God's eternal kingdom is mostly focused on this city. What's happening there, who's there, and we find out a little bit about the world beyond the city, but most of our attention for this chapter and a half is going to be focused on this particular city. So we need to understand it. We need to understand why it's there, why it's important, why do we have a 2.0, why don't we just build something new from scratch? And so what we have to do is we have to go back to the Old Testament, as I love to do, and I want to teach you a little bit about a theology of cities in the Bible. There's this theme that runs through the Bible, and it's not quite as prominent as some of the other themes, like the theme of redemption or the theme of corruption of sin even, like these themes that kind of keep popping up everywhere. But there's a theme that kind of goes from almost the very beginning of the Bible all the way here now literally to the end of the Bible, and it's a theme about the idea of cities. So cities play an important and interesting role in the unfolding story of the Bible. And I want to kind of go back and take a look at how have cities been important and how do they affect our understanding of the story itself, and also how does it affect our understanding of this new city that's going to come down from heaven or out of heaven from God. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to do here. And we're going to dive into some of these Old Testament stories, and I hope you'll forgive me. And maybe it'll help some of these Old Testament stories kind of link together in a new way in your head. That's really what I'm hoping will happen here. And again, the side note, I always do this, and it probably gets annoying after a while. This is one of the most important reasons why we read all of the Bible. We don't just read the parts of the New Testament that seem to be directly written towards us. We also read the Old Testament scriptures because the Old Testament scriptures give us the context for the New Testament scriptures, and a lot of times the New Testament scriptures resolve tensions that are introduced to the story in the first 2/3 of the Bible, which is the Old Testament, okay? Your knowledge of the Old Testament should be tight. It should be strong. It should be extensive. Not because it's always the most interesting, I hate to say it like that, but because the details in it are picked up on by the New Testament writers and given a certain conclusion to the story. So we need the Old Testament stuff. And we go back to one of my favorite I think, one of the most fascinating stories in the Bible, and that's the story of Cain. Story of Cain, all the way back in Genesis chapter 4. So while you're flipping back to Genesis chapter 4, or you can always push pause and find it and then start it again, here we go. Here's the first kind of like star blank I want you to put in here, okay? Early in the biblical story, it's mostly in the book of Genesis, but then also a little bit beyond, cities are portrayed in mostly a, here's the blank, negative light, okay? So you look at the early stages of the story, right? You look at the book of Genesis, for example, the book of Genesis, and you ask about cities, and cities are negative. Cities, we're not so sure, after reading the book of Genesis, we're not so sure that cities are a good idea at all. In fact, cities seem to bring out the worst in humanity. But let's talk about it specifically in the story of Cain. Now, you remember the story of Cain, I hope, right? It's like the classic sibling story, right? Every time your two kids are like fighting and yelling at each other and being mean to one another, we think about and we end up using this story to teach our children about the importance of not harboring resentment and anger against your brothers, right? Because Cain and Abel both offer God a sacrifice. Abel offers a lamb. Cain offers the first fruits of his, he was a farmer, so he brings the first fruits of the produce of the land. And they both offer them up to God, and God accepts Abel's sacrifice, and he does not accept Cain's. And Cain's mad. He's ticked. He's angry. He's frustrated. He feels rejected. He feels like God has turned away from him, and God has taken the best he could offer and kind of snubbed him. And he's mad. He's ticked off. And God comes to Cain. He's like, hey, Cain, look, if you do the right thing, I'll accept you too. It's not that I like Abel better than you. It's that his sacrifice, his offering is superior to yours. So take a page out of Abel's book and bring the right thing, and then I'll accept you too. Now, of course, if you understand how siblings work, that increases Cain's resentment, not diminishes it. And so Cain, instead of humbling himself, going to Abel and saying, Abel, can I trade you some of my crops for one of your sheep so that I can then offer God the sacrifice he wants? Cain decides he's going to punish Abel for being the one who God accepted. And so Cain lures his brother out into the field, and then Cain, we don't know how Cain kills him. It says he rose up against him and slew him, killed him. And we don't know how much time goes by, but God confronts Cain. And I tend to believe the text makes it seem like it's fairly quickly after the murder has happened. So I almost picture Abel's dead body lying on the ground, bleeding out into the ground, and then God confronting Cain. And you remember how it works, right? God comes to Cain and says, where's Abel? And then Cain, with the bitterness still intact in his voice, I would imagine, says, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And the funny thing is, right, is that it's sort of a jab at God too, because Cain is saying, look, aren't you supposed to take care of your people? Like Abel was one of the guys that you accepted, right? You accepted his offering. He's one of your people. Why don't you take care of your kids? Like, what's wrong with you, God? I'm not Abel's keeper. You're Abel's keeper, and you obviously haven't been doing a very good job of it. And so God basically says, here's what's going to happen. I can't believe you've done this. He says this in verse 10 of chapter 4. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And then he gives him a punishment, verse 11. And now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. God says, look, the punishment for your sin is that you are no longer going to be able to be a farmer. You are no longer going to be able to get any subsistence living from the land. The land is not going to produce fruit for you. So you could try all day and all night. You can plant and you can water and you can do all this stuff, and there's not going to be a crop. You're done. You're done being a farmer. I'm sorry. And instead, what I want you to do is I want you to be a wanderer in the earth, a fugitive and a wanderer. Now, why is he a fugitive? He's a fugitive because he killed his brother, and someone's going to want to have revenge. And he's a wanderer because he can't settle down because he's always got to be looking over his shoulder to run away from the person coming to attack him, okay? So God's desire for Cain is, Cain, from here on out, because of your sin, you're not going to be established in one place with a career and with a home and with a mailing address and a security deposit box and like all the things that go along with having home ownership and your own place in this earth. You're now going to wander around from place to place. Now, why does God do this? And I'm summarizing a lot of context here. But God, I don't think, is doing this just to be mean to Cain. What I think God is doing is he's trying to tell Cain, Cain, you got yourself into trouble because you thought you could be your own boss. You thought you could take my commands and you could just, if something makes you angry, you're just going to get rid of it. You're just going to fix all your own problems, solve your own problems with your own determination. And God's like, Cain, that's not how this is going to work, pal. That's not how this is going to work. What I want you to do is I want you to spend the rest of your life dependent upon me, trusting me from day to day for your provision of food, for your protection from the people trying to come after you. I want you to wander, never settle down, and I want you to go from place to place to trust me. Okay? So, that's the context. If you remember, Cain goes, oh, it's too much. I can't bear the punishment. And God, it's like, everybody who finds me is going to kill me. And God says, no, I'm going to put a mark on you so that people will leave you alone. God is still showing grace and mercy to Cain, saying, hey, Cain, look, this is not me trying to destroy you. This is me trying to correct this problem I see in your heart, this desire to be your own boss, to live independently of me, as if somehow you can take care of yourself and you don't need me for your life. You don't need to do things my way. I need to fix that in you. And so I want you to wander, and I want that life to teach you the value of trusting me moment to moment and for your protection and for your provision. And so what does Cain do? And this is where we get the first occurrence of the idea of a city in the Bible. And it's a very, very significant one. Chapter 4 goes down to verse 16. This is right after God has given Cain a mark, some kind of probably visible sign to stay away from him. Don't mess with Cain. Cain is under God's protection, right? And then verse 16 says this, then Cain went away from the presence of the Lord. And what's the next verb? What does he do? Does he wander around? No. He settles in the land of Nod, east of Eden. He settles somewhere. Well, but that wasn't the plan. That wasn't what God said Cain was supposed to do. Cain was supposed to wander. Why in the world is Cain settling down? And then look at verse 17. Cain knew his wife. She conceived and bore Enoch. He's settling down and having a family. Now, maybe God intended for him to have a family and to take his family along with him in his journeys, his wanderings, but this is not the actions of someone who's taking God's commands seriously. Verse 17 continues, when he built a city, he called the name of the city after the name of his son, Enoch. Cain builds a city. Now, I don't need to tell you that a city is not the same thing as a tent, right? A tent, you sleep in, you pack it up, you carry it to the next place you're going to go. A tent is the home of someone who is a wanderer, a nomad, right? Cain doesn't want that life. He doesn't want to wander around depending upon God for his protection and his provision. He doesn't want to live rootless. He decides instead, you know what I want to do? I'm going to build myself a city. I'm going to establish my own kingdom. I'm going to plop myself down, put my roots down into the ground, have a family, build a city, surround myself with other humans who want to live with me in my city. And together, we are going to build a civilization. And this civilization is going to change the world. Now, if you just read that on its own, you're like, oh, that sounds noble. He wants to build a life for himself and his family and a civilization, except for this. Look at the first blank there, the first point under Cain's city. Cain builds a city in direct disobedience to God's command to wander. God told Cain to wander and trust me. And Cain goes, no thanks. I'm going to settle down and I'm going to build my own life. And I don't need you, God, to protect me. And I don't need you, God, to provide for me, because I can surround myself with a bunch of other people, and there's safety in numbers and there's provision in numbers. Because even if I can't be a farmer, I can charge rent to the people who want to live in my city, and they can farm outside the city and they can bring in the produce to the city. And that way I still have my needs provided for. So Cain's disobeying God by building this city. That's significant. That's really important. The second subpoint here, Cain's city is the beginning of an entire civilization. That's the next blank, civilization. If you read the rest of chapter 4, what you discover is that Cain's descendants are geniuses. They're brilliant. They learn how to do things like the idea of livestock, domesticating animals, and then using those animals as a form of wealth and to provide for your needs. They also invent the idea of music, instruments, and all that stuff. Then there's also, they invent and they start to mess with metallurgy, right? The forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. Like, they're innovators, and they're building this civilization, and they're huddling together saying, how can we make life easier? I know, we'll take these wild animals, we'll domesticate them, and then we'll grow them, and when we need to, we'll kill them for food, or we'll use them for milk or whatever. And then, you know what? We're going to enjoy life a little bit. We're going to do music and just be able to sit around a fire and play instruments and delight in music. And then also too, we're gonna build tools to help us build our cities and build things better and make life easier for ourselves. Like, Cain's descendants were the ones who made this happen. And you could look at that and go, wow, what an incredible civilization. However, there are some problems with this too. So you see the incredible advantages of huddling together in a city, right? You put all these people, all these minds together, good things in some senses are going to happen. You're going to have innovation. You're going to have technological advances. You're going to have breakthroughs. Because humans do that. Like, you put us in a place and we start to fix things and build things and do things. And that in a sense, that's a reflection of the image of God in us. That's a wonderful thing. However, there's also an unexpected consequence of huddling together in these massive cities. What is that unexpected consequence? All of a sudden, they start to invent other things too. They invent the concept of polygamy. One of Cain's descendants decides to have 2 wives instead of 1. And then another one of their descendants, Lamech, decides that he's going to kill someone for offending me. What does it say? I have killed a man for wounding me, verse 23, a young man for striking me. And if Cain's revenge is 7-fold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. They invent the idea of revenge and vendettas. And you hurt me once, I'm going to hurt you 5 times. You know, I remember at one time I was talking to this one guy who was talking about these people that were out to get him, and he used to have this this braggadocious attitude where he's like, you know what, you come after me, you better kill me, because if you don't, I'm going to come after you and take care of you and your family, and just talking all this blah 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 stuff. Well, that braggadocious attitude, that self-centered, in Spanish is a great word, is machismo, that macho attitude, was invented by Cain and his descendants because they decided, you know what, we're in charge. We're in charge of our world. We don't need God to provide for us. We don't need God to protect us. We're all we need. And so we're going to do what we want. If I want to have 2 wives, I'm going to have 2 wives. If I want to punish somebody and kill somebody who wounds me, I'm going to do it. If I want to brag about it and pound my chest and have that be the sign, and everybody in this society needs to fear me because I'm a guy you don't mess with, that's what we're going to do. So what you find is that Cain's city is the beginning of an entire, here's the blank, civilization, right? That leads to the deep wickedness, that's the next blank, that causes God to judge the world with a flood. It's Cain and his descendants that directly leads to sin multiplying so much in the earth that God has no choice but to wipe them out. That's the result, right? Of huddling together. Not only does it bring out the best in us in the terms of technological advancements and tool making and music making and culture building. Like all that stuff is beautiful. But we also get together and our worst impulses get worse too. We learn new ways of sin. And we get to a point, or at least Cain's descendants got to a point just in chapter 6, where God's like, verse 5 of chapter 6 says, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Like Moses is trying really hard to make you understand that humanity was so far gone just by this point. The sin had corrupted all the way to every thought and intention of their heart continually. Like there's nothing good left. You know, sometimes I'll go and I grab a potato because I'm in charge of making mashed potatoes in my house whenever we do that. It's sort of a thing I've adopted. I kind of borrowed it from Jill's grandfather who kind of taught me how to do it. And so I kind of do the mashed potatoes thing. And sometimes I'll grab a potato and I look at it and I'm like, okay, there's a little piece there that I'm going to have to cut off, right? It's starting to not rot, but it's like got the black stuff and you got to cut that out. But once I cut it out, it's still a potato. I'll put it in the thing in the Instapot, which by the way, Instapot, I'm all about the Instapot. Instapots are amazing. Put it in the Instapot and 20 minutes later, it's going to be ready to go. Where was I going with that? Oh, humanity is like a potato that is completely oozing with corruption and putrid filth. And God's looking for, okay, what part can I save to put in the thing? And the only part of all of humanity he can save is one dude. Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, their wives. 8 humans out of who knows how many million, or at least 100,000. I don't know how quickly humanity has spread at this point, but there's enough people. There's a lot of people. 8? There's only 8 people that you can save out of this? Third point under Cain's city. Cain's city represents fallen man's determination to make life work, and here's the blank, independently of God. Cain's city is not just a place where he lived. It represented something. It was like a giant middle finger to God, saying, you know what? I don't need to trust you. I don't need to follow you. I don't need you to provide for me. I don't need you to protect me. I don't need you to take care of me. I can take care of myself. I'm going to build me a city where everything that I need and everything that I want is already provided for, and where all my enemies can't get to me because I'm protected and safe. I am fine on my own. And in Cain's world, I mean, the first encounter we have with a city, that's an incredibly negative message. God says, I want you to wander. I don't want you to huddle together in cities with other people. I want you to spread out and fill the earth, right? Well, apparently that's not what Cain wants to do. So his city represents this spirit of independence, right? I'm going to make my life work without God. I don't need God. Then we come to the next major story with a city in it. And that next major story is just a few pages on in Genesis chapter 11, which is the Tower of Babel. But really it's the city, and then there's a tower in the middle of the city. Take a look at verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they settled there. And they said to one another, come, let's make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. And they said, come, let's build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let's make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Okay, so here's the next blank here. So humanity post-flood, this is after the flood, right? So the flood comes, wipes everybody out except for Noah, his 3 sons, and their families, and they slowly begin the process of repopulating the earth, filling the earth with more and more people. And now people are starting to travel, because where they first landed, when the ark crashes into the mountains, they kind of come down the hill and they settle there for a while. And I'm sure they make a settlement. And then from there, people are like, okay, there's a little too much. We need not enough space. We got to spread out. So they spread out. And as they're spreading out, they come to this plain of Shinar, and they're like, ooh, I like this. This is perfect for building a city. And again, what you see incredible ingenuity and creativity and technological brilliance. These people are making bricks. They're burning them. They have plans for how they're going to build this. And they have goals, man. They're ambitious. They want to build a tower that the top reaches up into the sky. Like they want a major major imprint, and he says, we want to make a name for ourselves. And then they say this really interesting thing, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Now, why is that a problem? I thought that was the point. In fact, it is the point. You look back in Genesis chapter 9, verse 1, it says, and God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That was what God told them to do. And then again in verse 7 of chapter 9, he says, and you be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth and multiply in it. God intends for humanity to spread out, fill up the earth. Don't huddle in one place, spread out. Take what God I have given you and bless the entire earth with it, and break up into family groups. And of course you need each other to some extent, but yeah, spread out, man. There's lots of room. There's a lot of room to grow. There's a lot of room to expand. So go, spread out. Humanity in chapter 11 says, nah, I don't think so. I don't want to be dispersed over the whole earth. Because if I send my engineer off to settle some other place, then when I need him to build my walls, he's not going to be there to help me. And maybe there's one guy's like, you know what, I'm not so good with plants and farming, and I need somebody to help me with that, and I'll help them with something. I'll do their taxes or whatever. You know, I'll trade my ability to do their taxes for their ability to provide food for me, and that way we can have this negotiation, this free market thing. And again, those things aren't bad in of themselves, except that they desired to stay huddled together in direct disobedience to what God had intended. Now, my belief is that once God spread everybody out, then he intended for people to build societies and build cities. I don't think there's anything sinful about the idea of a city. It's just that in these first two examples of a city in the book of Genesis, what we realize is whenever humanity huddles together, they huddle together for good reasons, and good things come from it in the form of technological advance and culture and all that. And there's also a lot of bad things because all of these fallen humans who are all determined to make life work apart from God kind of get together and they encourage the worst parts of themselves to go forward. And all of a sudden now they're motivated not by desire to make God's name known in the world, to be his representatives in the world, which is theoretically what it means to be in the image of God. I represent God to the world. I don't represent myself to the world. I'm just sort of a vessel God uses. Now they want to make a name for themselves, and they definitely don't want to do what God wants them to do. So they have the attitude of Cain. Still, the attitude of Cain has survived the flood. And here's humanity on the other side of the flood when they should have known better. Like this kind of led to a bad thing just a little while ago. They're like, no, we're right back to where we are. We want to huddle together. We want to disobey God's commands. And we want to marshal all of our skills and our talents and our abilities and all of humankind's ability to change the world. And we're going to be in charge. We're going to build a city. We're going to build a tower with its top reaching to heaven. We're going to make a name for ourselves. A couple of description statements here. Humanity post-flood builds a city in direct disobedience to God's command to spread out and fill the earth. So for one thing, for them, this is a disobedient act, which is why when God comes down and he sees it, it's funny. If you read the story, God comes down to see this city that they've built, and he goes, wow. When they put their minds to it, they can really do something. However, he knew this all along. What they've put their mind together to do is disobedient. They're really, really good at what they do. The problem is what they do is disobedience. What they do is rebellion. What they do is sin against God. That's what they do. And when they get a whole bunch of people together, they're just going to help each other do the disobedience thing even better. Second point here. Humanity is building this city and the tower for the express purpose of disregarding God's will that they spread out and sending a message to God that they are masters. That's the last blank there. Masters of their own fate. I want a name for myself. I don't care about your name. I don't care the fact that I bear in me the mark of you and your image. I want to be the story. I want to be the center of the existence. I want everybody to know I'm a big deal. Look at what I have been able to do. And humanity has been doing this ever since, building cities to themselves, to their own glory, making a name for themselves. And this leads me to the third point there underneath the Tower of Babel. This story warns us that fallen humanity has almost limitless potential for two things. Evil is the first blank, and rebellion, when they band together in large numbers in cities. It's not the city itself that's a sin. It's that everybody is together with all of their fallenness, and they encourage all the worst instincts inside of us. The instincts to rebel, the instincts to invent new ways of doing evil, the instincts to turn away from God and become masters of our own fate. When we're all there together, we just kind of encourage one another down that road. And that's not a good thing. It just seems inevitable. When you start huddling everybody together and they start working together, it seems inevitable for fallen humans that pride and hubris begin to rise up. And as they band together, humanity will accomplish incredible things. Have you heard that humanity put other humans on the moon? Like, that actually happened. Well, again, some people still disagree with that, but I tend to believe it's true. They put people on the moon. They walked around on the moon. I don't know how many thousand miles away it is. It's like hundreds of thousands of miles away. There's no air out there. How in the world are they going to get there? How are they going to walk around? How are they going to get back safely? And we've done it. Now, again, there may be accomplishments to come that are even more impressive than that, but that's quite an accomplishment, isn't it? Humanity is capable of incredible things when they band together. Problem is, we also tend to get to increase in a what's the word I'm looking for? In a proportional way, our pride goes through the roof. You remember Nebuchadnezzar? We've talked about him at length at other times, other studies. He was the king of Babylon. Babylon was the most renowned city of its day, the center and the capital of the empire of the Babylonians, of Nebuchadnezzar and all of his guys, right? In fact, Babylon was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. They had these hanging gardens that they would plant from the tops of the buildings of the city. So you look out over the city and you think you're looking at a garden, when really what you're looking at is a city man-made with the incredible, just the workmanship and the creativity and the artistic beauty of that, bringing the gardens to the city. And in Daniel chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar is strolling around on his rooftop looking at this amazing city. And what does he say? I've got to read it for you word for word. Because this is what happens when humanity clusters together in cities. Fallen humanity. People trying to make a name for themselves. What happens? Nebuchadnezzar says something like this. Oh man, I got to get the right verse here. Okay. Verse 29, at the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? He might as well just be echoing exactly what the people in the Tower of Babel said. I want to make a name for myself. Look at this amazing city I've built. I'm the master of my own fate. No one's going to tell me what to do. I'm the boss. I'm in charge. It's incredible how much potential there is for pride and arrogance and hubris when we huddle together and have our little accomplishments and build our little projects and do our thing. We get really impressed with ourselves and we end up turning away from God even more. And our pride and our arrogance makes it impossible for us to have the humble relationship with God that we were designed to have. So early in the story, cities are not positive things. Cities are things that lead you away from your obedience and your duty to God and cause you to be filled with arrogance and pride to think you can do better than what God can do. Now, I just want to mention something from a chapter that I don't think I've ever heard a sermon or a Sunday school lesson on, and that's Genesis chapter 10. In Genesis chapter 10, we have a list of all the different nations that are starting to grow out of Noah's descendants after the flood. And we come to chapter 10, verses 8 through 12, or verse 6, the sons of Ham. Ham is one of the three sons of Noah. The sons of Ham are Kush. Now, that becomes a great empire in southern Africa, okay? Egypt, we've heard of that name before, right? Put, haven't heard that one so much. And Canaan. Canaan is the area of the promised land, right? Where Abraham will eventually settle and all that good stuff. And then we have the sons of Kush, Seba, Havilah, Sabta, Rama, and Sabteka. The sons of Rama are Sheba and Dedan. Kush, this is another one of the sons of Ham, right? Kush fathered Nimrod. He was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. Now look at verse 10. The beginning of his kingdom. This is the very first time we have the word and the idea of kingdom being introduced to the world. So Cain and then Noah and his descendants invented the idea of kingship. And it says this, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And Babel, of course, becomes Babylon. And then we also have Erech, Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh, Rehoboth-ir, Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. What we see here is an empire, the very first human empire that is established, okay? And Nimrod is the head of this empire. So go ahead and follow along, I think, on your blanks there, under Nimrod's empire. Nimrod seems to be the first empire builder, because he's built not just a city, right? A civilization around one city. He has built multiple cities spread out over a wide area, and they're all linked together, and he's the king of all those cities. He's in charge of all those cities, and the goal of having all those cities spread out over a wide range of area is to be able to bring all that land and all the people who live there under his control. And two of the prominent cities that are mentioned are Babel, or Babylon later, and Nineveh in Assyria, the land between the rivers, okay? So Nimrod builds this first empire. Now, the thing we notice about these cities is that these cities appear much later in the story. And they're not pleasant. They're not wonderful places. They don't do great things for God and for God's people. These are cities that are dedicated to controlling and dominating the earth and opposing God and opposing and oppressing God's people and trying to take them under control. Assyria was the nation that eventually caused the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes in the north. And of course, Babylon is the kingdom that eventually destroys Judah, the southern province, the southern kingdom of Israel. So these are the two greatest enemies of God's people over the course of time. And it all started with a guy who built a bunch of cities and strung them together into an empire. And so what I think is happening here, and this is the second blank, or the second statement here under Nimrod's empire, Moses is trying to warn us that cities full of fallen people become the foundation of empires that rise to, number one, oppose God, and number two, oppress God's people in the world. These pagan cities that Nimrod establishes become also pagan worship centers as well. Because linked together in the ancient mind is always political power and religious power. Those two things are tied together. It's the gods who give me political power. And so when I build my political center, my capital, I'm going to also build a temple to my God in my city, so that my God, who gives me the strength to fight militarily and politically, my God will always take care of me because I'm taking care of him in this city. And these empires rise up, and eventually they become the people that the forces in the world that oppose God and end up oppressing and damaging God's people in the world. So all the early, not to mention, we haven't talked about Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis chapter 18, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, which were the big cities in Canaan at the time, the place everybody wanted to move to, seemingly the Las Vegas of their time, or the New York City of their time. And that's where the most wicked, vile, the wickedness was so bad, God had to blow up the city. Again, it's like Noah all over again. Humanity, as they build in these cities, they get to a point of so much saturation and corruption of sin that God has to step in and God has to judge. So the early message of the Bible, especially in the book of Genesis, is that cities, I'm not so sure cities are a good idea. Cities are a little bit on the negative side. Now, let me hit one more section here, and then we'll move on talking about Jerusalem probably next week. But I want to point out to you something. So time goes by. Abraham wanders around in Canaan, never settles down, never has his own city. Abraham and his descendants eventually escape to Egypt, another one of the sons of Ham, right, that established their own kingdom, their own empire down in what we know of today as Egypt. And they're oppressed there. They become slaves there, right? They're building cities for Pharaoh with the sweat of their brow and the blood probably coming from their veins. Like, the Jewish people build cities for Pharaoh as the greatest kind of oppression they experience as a nation for 400 years. And then Moses comes. Moses sets them free from that captivity. And then he leads them back to Canaan, back to the land God had promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And as they're going there, they have to kind of pass through all this stuff. They wander around for 40 years. It's a long story. And they finally, with Joshua, go into the promised land. And then, of course, they do what humans do. They settle in cities. In fact, in some cases, they clear out the Canaanites who had lived there, who either died or were killed or who fled the cities to escape. And they just sort of like take possession of the cities that already exist. But cities in the promised land after the Exodus, during the time of Joshua and Judges, cities are, here's the blank here, the second major point. Cities in the promised land post-Exodus are trivialized. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that there are no major, massive, big, important cities. There's places where people congregate and they have all the advantages that you would have of a city, but they're not massive cities. In fact, that's, Jericho. When Joshua comes in, right, they go to the city and the walls fall down and they destroy the city and the people. And that's kind of what they do throughout the entire land. And they don't set up, okay, here's the capital city of Israel. In fact, that's the first arrow there. The first Israelites to live in Canaan have no capital city. No capital city. And apparently this is on purpose. When God, the time of Joshua and the Judges, okay, is a very chaotic time for the people because there's disadvantages to this as well. But the advantage of this is that Israel has no centralized power. God says, I want this tribe to go there. I want you to spread out, just like he said to the people back in the day. I want you to spread out through the entire promised land and settle it. And I'm gonna rip it into 12 pieces. And each one of you is going to get your own piece. Now go spread out, settle it. There's no central location. There's no capital city. There's no king, right? There's no emperor. You got your elders in each tribe, and you sort of just figure it out. Now, the problem with that, as Israel finds out very quickly, is that when you're attacked by enemies, you also don't have anywhere to call 911, right? Like if there's no central... Like even if you think about our world today, if they actually did the ridiculous thing of defunding the police, right? And maybe breaking down government and saying, okay, there's no more city governments, there's no more state governments, there's no more federal government. You're on your own, keep your own money, we won't do taxes. So I have more money in my pocket from my taxes, but here's the problem. When my property is threatened, I don't have anybody to call to come help me. Except hopefully my neighbors who like me. And if they don't like me, I'm in big trouble, right? Hopefully I have like 9,000 kids apparently to protect my own property, my own stuff, because that's just the way this works. That's the advantage of being in a city and of having a government structure is you have somebody to call when things go bad. So Israel finds out, oh shoot, I got these foreign countries coming to attack me. I've got no king and no army to call to help me fight them off. So we got to figure this out ourselves. And you look at the book of Judges, there's lots of starts and stops. There's lots of problems with that. Everything is as decentralized as possible. Now, I think part of the reason for this is not just because God loves to be inefficient. We know that God is not a God of inefficiency. He is a God of order and structure. It's not that God hates structure. It's that God wants Israel to be a different kind of nation from the nations around them, right? Because the nations around them have these kind of cities, these kind of structures, these kind of governments. You have a Pharaoh who thinks he has the right to enslave an entire nation of people and have them build his cities for them. And then when he wants to, he's going to just kill their babies and throw them in the Nile River. That's how humanity has done power and government and authority. And God's like, no, I want my people to be different. I don't want to have some centralized government and have someone take control over everybody and have all the power. I'm going to spread out the power. And if there's a problem, I'll give power to a judge in that area. They'll solve it. All right? God sees himself as the king of Israel. There's no human king. So when you need help, where are you supposed to go during the time of Joshua and the judges? You're supposed to cry out to your king. And since your king is not a guy who lives on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. or wherever, in the Kremlin or wherever, you have to cry out to God. Again, this forces the people to be dependent upon God. I need God because I can't just turn to a king to solve my problems for me, to fix my problems. I need God desperately. Can you see maybe why God wanted it to be that way? Why when they come to him and say, God, we want a king like all the other nations, that God takes it personal, right? Oh, you want somebody else to take care of me because you don't think I can take care of you. You don't like the way I take care of you, so you want a human to turn to give you the kind of help you want to have. God wants his people to be different. He wants the structure to be different. Now, eventually we know from Deuteronomy, God did intend to bring human kings into the scene at some point in Israel's future. But at this point, God wants them to stay spread out, decentralized, and vulnerable because they're going to depend upon him and look to him to be their king. It's basically undoing the problem that Cain and the people of the Tower of Babel and Nimrod had gotten humanity into. He said, let's do this differently. Let's not put our trust and our hope in armies and in governments and in kings. Let's put our trust and our hope in the God who made us, in the God who saved us from those evil, oppressive governments and gave us a new start. Let's try this a new way. Okay, so the second arrow there. The closest thing to a capital city in the promised land is the tabernacle. That's what goes in that blank there, in the tabernacle. Now, here's an interesting thing. When the children of Israel were wandering throughout the desert, a tabernacle makes sense, right? Because the people are on their way somewhere. You don't want to build a permanent structure in the desert if you're trying to get to the promised land. So a tabernacle makes sense. It's mobile. You can strap it all down and you can carry it with you until the next place you have to stop and rest. You set it up, you worship, you gain guidance from God, who's your king. You have your sins forgiven. It's wonderful. It's great. It's awesome. It's all those wonderful things. But then once you get to the promised land, doesn't it make sense that the tabernacle goes away and we build some kind of a permanent structure in the land where God was sending us to go? Now that we've reached the finish line, shouldn't we find a place for God to be? And yet, during the time of Joshua and the judges, and even into the time of Samuel, and even into the time of Saul, who's the first king of Israel, there is no permanent structure for God, the king, to live in. There's no capital city. There's little cities where different people live that are important to those people, but they don't have a national significance, don't have a national presence. But you have this tabernacle, and even in the time of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and even King Saul, the tabernacle continues to move throughout the 12 tribes. It's by Shiloh for a while. Then it relocates over here somewhere else for a while. It's in a constant state of movement. And I guess the idea is that as God wants the tabernacle to move from one place to the other, he directs the priests who pack everything up and they move it and set it up somewhere else. God's home, and that's the next blank, the third arrow. The tabernacle was God's home, his home, but it was mobile. God lived in a mobile home for a lot of years, and he loved it. Maybe if we lived in a mobile home, we'd love it too. I don't know. I tend to see the disadvantages of that in my own personal life, but God seems to really have enjoyed the mobile home experience. He loved being able to take his presence and his power and his kingship and his capital city from place to place, to visit with this tribe for a while, and then to go with this tribe for a while, and go with this tribe for a while. And again, he determines when and for how long and all that wonderful stuff. But the key thing is that God's in charge of that, right? The closest thing that we have post-Exodus in the Promised Land to a capital city is this tabernacle. Because it's not just a religious center, right? It's not just a place you go to have your sins forgiven by your God. It's a political center as well, because God, who is your God, who forgives your sins and all that religious stuff, he also is your king who helps you when you have armies attacking you, who makes the rain fall so that you have enough provision to eat the food you need to eat. Do you see what's happening here? The tabernacle is God's capital. But according to God's original plan, that capital was never to be fixed in one place. Now, that becomes important next week when we talk about how King David changes all of that. He takes that idea and he turns it inside out or upside down or puts it on its head, and he decides to transition God's home from the temporary, the mobile home of the tabernacle to something more permanent. And that's where the first time in the Bible, the city of Jerusalem becomes important. And again, understanding Jerusalem 1.0 is the basis for understanding what Jerusalem 2.0 in God's eternal kingdom is all about. So does that make sense? Initially, cities were not considered to be a good thing because all of the fallen humans get together and they just multiply their fallenness and end up shaking their fist at God even more because of the fact that they're all together. And then when God finally rescues his people from one of those cities, one of those governments, one of those oppressive structures where people use top-down power to get their way and to make a name for themselves, when God sets his people free, he deliberately does not duplicate that system in the new world, in this new country, in the Promised Land. He initially sets it up as this decentralized thing because he wants his people to have a different approach to him than the nations have to their gods. He wants his people to see him as the king that they turn to for protection and for provision. And that's where we're going to hit the end for today. And next week we're going to come back and look at how that changed in light of the actions of God's handpicked king, David. So I hope you come back. Again, we're building a basis for this. We're going to get back to the New Jerusalem 2.0. But if we don't understand the first Jerusalem 1.0, why it's important, what it meant to the people who are writing the Bible, it just won't make sense to us. And I think when we come around to the end, it'll be that much more powerful because we'll have seen how the story has developed. So we'll see you next week. It's going to be May. I can't believe it. Hopefully I'll still have I'll be able to get rid of my sweatshirt. But either way, I'll be back to teach you a little bit more about how the story ends. Looking forward to it. See you next time.